I'm Benjamin Rivers, 42, a certified public accountant who spent 15 years building a modest tax preparation business from the ground up. 3 years ago, I was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for tax fraud, money I swore I never stole. The conviction destroyed my career, my marriage, and my faith in justice itself. I lost everything while maintaining my innocence from behind bars. But last month, a routine audit uncovered something that would vindicate me in the most shocking way possible: the missing $2.3 million sitting in IRS Agent Patricia Valdez's personal offshore account. What happened next would expose a web of corruption that reached far deeper than anyone imagined, and prove that sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. If you've ever felt powerless against the system or questioned whether justice truly exists, this story will restore your faith. Like and subscribe for more stories of truth prevailing against impossible odds. The business license certificate hanging on my office wall seemed so simple when I first received it in 2008. Benjamin Rivers, certified public accountant, authorized to practice in the state of Oregon. I was 33 then, full of hope and determination to build something meaningful from nothing. Rivers Tax Services started in a cramped second-floor office above a coffee shop in downtown Portland. The rent was affordable, the location decent, and the smell of fresh coffee drifting upstairs each morning felt like a good omen. I had 3 clients that first year: my landlord, my neighbor, and my college roommate's mother. Each tax return I prepared was a small victory, a building block toward the dream I'd carried since graduating from Portland State University. My approach was simple: treat every client's financial information as sacred. I believed that trust was the foundation of any successful accounting practice. While other CPAs rushed through returns to maximize volume, I took time to understand each client's unique situation. I asked questions, explained deductions, and made sure they understood every line of their tax return. Word spread slowly but steadily. Mrs. Chun recommended me to her book club. The owner of the hardware store sent his brother-in-law. By year 3, I was handling over 200 individual returns and had moved to a proper office space with a receptionist and a small conference room. The modest success felt monumental to someone who'd grown up in a single-parent household where every dollar mattered. I specialized in small businesses and working families, people who needed an accountant who cared about their financial well-being, not just their ability to pay premium fees. My reputation grew around one simple principle: absolute honesty. I never promised deductions I couldn't deliver, never cut corners that might trigger audits, and always erred on the side of caution when tax law was ambiguous. The community embraced Rivers Tax Services because they knew I understood their struggles. I'd grown up in Portland, attended local schools, and understood the challenges of making ends meet in an increasingly expensive city. My clients weren't just customers, they were neighbors, friends, and fellow members of a community I was proud to serve. By 2015, I had built something I could be genuinely proud of. The business was stable, profitable, and growing. I employed 2 part-time assistants during tax season and had earned the respect of other professionals in the area. Local attorneys referred clients to me for tax planning, and I had developed relationships with several banks that recommended my services to their small business customers. That was the year I met Jessica at a community fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. She was volunteering at the registration table, her laugh infectious as she helped confused attendees find their assigned tables. I spent most of the evening working up the courage to introduce myself, finally approaching her during the silent auction with some lame comment about the donated artwork. She was an elementary school teacher, passionate about education and committed to making a difference in children's lives. We talked for hours that night about our shared values, our dreams for the future, and our belief that success meant more than just financial achievement. She respected my dedication to my clients, and I admired her commitment to her students. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the community center where we'd first met. Our reception was attended by clients, students' families, and friends who had become like family. It felt like the perfect beginning to the next chapter of our lives together. Jessica brought balance to my sometimes obsessive attention to detail. She reminded me to take vacations, to enjoy the success we'd built, and to dream about expanding beyond just tax preparation. We talked about starting a family, maybe buying a house with a yard, and growing old together while watching our business and our community thrive. Those were the golden years, when everything seemed possible and the future stretched ahead like an open road. The client portfolio binder that organized my most valued accounts represented years of careful relationship building. At the top of that list sat Cascade Construction, a third-generation family business that had become my largest and most complex client. Robert Cascade had built the company from a small residential contractor into a multi-state operation, handling everything from highway projects to commercial developments. When his son Michael took over operations in 2018, they brought their accounting to me based on a referral from their bank. The complexity of their multi-state tax obligations made them exactly the kind of challenging client I thrived on helping. Cascade Construction operated in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, which meant navigating 3 different state tax systems while managing federal obligations for a business generating nearly $12 million annually. Their projects range from public infrastructure to private commercial developments, each with unique tax implications and documentation requirements. I took pride in the thousands of dollars I saved them each year through careful planning and legitimate deductions. Construction companies face unique challenges: equipment depreciation, project-based accounting, and the complexities of prevailing wage compliance. I spent hours studying tax code changes that might affect their industry, attending seminars on construction accounting, and building relationships with other professionals who specialized in their sector. Michael Cascade appreciated my attention to detail and proactive approach. Unlike his father, who had been content with basic compliance, Michael wanted strategic tax planning that would support the company's growth. We met quarterly to review their financial position and plan for upcoming projects. I helped them structure equipment purchases to maximize depreciation benefits and advised them on the tax implications of expanding into new markets. The relationship was exactly what I'd hoped to build when I started my practice: a partnership based on trust, expertise, and mutual respect. Michael often said that having me as their CPA was like having a financial advisor and tax attorney rolled into one at a fraction of the cost. But in early 2021, something shifted. The first sign came during a routine call from Michael about a new project in Sacramento. He mentioned that someone from the IRS had been asking questions about their company at the local Contractors Association meeting. Nothing formal, just casual inquiries about their operations and growth. 2 weeks later, I received my first contact from Patricia Valdez. She introduced herself as a senior revenue agent with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, conducting what she described as a routine compliance review of several construction companies in the Pacific Northwest. Her tone was professional but carried an undertone that made me uneasy. Patricia was in her late 40s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of wielding federal authority. She had steel-gray hair pulled back in a perfect bun and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my office during her initial visit. Her questions started innocuously enough: general inquiries about my practice, my client base, and my procedures for handling complex business returns, but something felt wrong from the beginning. Her questions were too specific, too focused on Cascade Construction, and delivered with the intensity that seemed disproportionate to a routine audit. She asked about their equipment purchases, their project accounting methods, and their expansion into California with the kind of detail that suggested she'd already done extensive research. I answered her questions honestly and professionally, but my instincts screamed warning. In 15 years of practice, I dealt with numerous IRS inquiries and audits. This felt different, more like an interrogation than an information-gathering session. Patricia's body language suggested she'd already reached conclusions and was simply looking for confirmation. When she left that first day, I immediately called Michael to warn him about the inquiry. His reaction surprised me. He seemed almost relieved, saying they'd been expecting something like this given their recent growth and the IRS's increased focus on the construction industry. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something much more dangerous than a routine compliance review. The audit notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official weight that makes your stomach drop. The envelope bore the Treasury Department seal and Patricia Valdez's signature, formally notifying me that Rivers Tax Services and our client Cascade Construction were under investigation for potential tax fraud. Patricia's return visits became a weekly occurrence, each one more invasive than the last. She arrived with different agents, carried additional boxes of files, and asked increasingly personal questions about my business practices. What had started as professional inquiries evolved into something that felt more like psychological warfare. During her third visit, she questioned my fee structure with Cascade Construction. Why did I charge a flat annual retainer instead of hourly billing? Had I ever received any payments or benefits beyond my standard fees? The implications were clear. She was fishing for evidence of some kind of kickback arrangement or under-the-table compensation. I explained my billing practices with complete transparency. The retainer structure allowed Cascade Construction to budget their accounting costs while giving me predictable income to plan my business operations. Everything was documented, reported, and completely above board. But Patricia's skeptical expression suggested she viewed my explanations as elaborate cover stories. Her questions shifted from professional to personal during the fourth visit. She wanted to know about my relationship with Michael Cascade outside of business. Had we socialized together? Had I ever vacationed with the family? Did I have any personal financial dealings with company principals? The line of questioning felt like preparation for something much more serious than a tax audit. That's when I made the decision to hire attorney Michael Brennan. I'd known Michael since law school. We'd both grown up in Portland and shared similar values about serving our community. His practice focused on white-collar criminal defense, and his reputation for integrity made him the obvious choice when I realized I needed legal representation. Michael's initial assessment was reassuring but cautious. He reviewed all my documentation for Cascade Construction and found everything in perfect order. The tax returns were accurate, the deductions legitimate, and the documentation comprehensive. But he warned me that federal investigations often take unexpected turns, and Patricia's aggressive approach suggested she was building towards something significant. 2 weeks after hiring Michael, Patricia dropped the bombshell that changed everything. She arrived at my office with a briefcase full of documents and a confident smile that chilled me to the bone. She claimed to have discovered serious irregularities in Cascade Construction's tax filings over the past 3 years. According to Patricia, Cascade Construction had systematically underreported income, while claiming fraudulent deductions for equipment purchases and subcontractor payments. The alleged scheme involved creating false invoices, backdating equipment purchases, and manipulating project accounting to hide nearly $2.3 million in taxable income over 3 years. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I knew every line of every tax return I'd prepared for Cascade Construction. I'd personally reviewed every invoice, verified every deduction, and maintained meticulous documentation for every transaction. The idea that there were irregularities was impossible unless someone had been manipulating documents. After I'd completed the returns, I spent the next 48 hours frantically reviewing every file, every backup document, and every piece of correspondence related to Cascade Construction. Everything remained exactly as I'd prepared it, accurate, legitimate, and properly documented. But somehow, Patricia claimed to have evidence of systematic fraud. Michael Brennan's reaction to Patricia's allegations was immediate and concerned. He'd seen federal prosecutors build cases on less evidence, and the specificity of her claims suggested she had access to information that went beyond standard audit procedures. He warned me that criminal charges might be imminent and advised me to prepare for the possibility that my life was about to change dramatically. The moment Patricia informed me that criminal charges were being prepared, I felt my world begin to tilt off its axis. 15 years of building my reputation, my business, and my relationships were about to be destroyed by allegations I knew were false. But proving my innocence would require resources and time I wasn't sure I possessed. Word of the investigation spread through Portland's business community like wildfire. Despite our attempts to keep the matter confidential, the criminal complaint arrived like a sledgehammer to everything I'd built. Federal agents appeared at my office on a Thursday morning, badges gleaming as they served the warrant. The document was terrifyingly precise: conspiracy to defraud the Internal Revenue Service of exactly $2.3 million in unpaid taxes, within hours. News vans lined the street outside my office. The local television stations led with stories about another corrupt accountant who betrayed his client's trust. My picture appeared on the evening news, alongside headlines that painted me as a greedy professional who had sold out his principles. For money, the specificity of the charges was what haunted me most. Not approximately $2.3 million, not over $2 million. Exactly $2,300,000. The precision suggested someone had carefully calculated every dollar they intended to steal and had crafted the perfect cover story to explain its disappearance. Jessica's initial reaction was unwavering support. She knew my character, understood my business practices, and refused to believe I was capable of the crimes described in the complaint. But as details emerged in the local papers, details that somehow made their way from sealed court documents to front-page stories, I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. The Portland Business Journal ran a detailed expose about my lavish lifestyle and suspicious growth of Rivers Tax Services. They highlighted our recent purchase of a modest home in southeast Portland and my decision to lease a newer Honda Accord as evidence of unexplained wealth. The fact that both purchases were fully documented and financed through legitimate means seemed irrelevant to the narrative they were constructing. My clients began abandoning me en masse. Phone calls went unreturned, scheduled appointments were canceled, and longtime relationships evaporated overnight. People who had trusted me with their most sensitive financial information suddenly viewed me as a criminal who might have compromised their own tax returns. The isolation was devastating. Friends stopped calling, professional colleagues crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations, and the community that had embraced Rivers Tax Services now treated me like a pariah. I understood their reaction: who wants to be associated with someone accused of federal crimes? But the speed of the abandonment was breathtaking. Patricia Valdez's role as the prosecution's star witness became clear during the pretrial hearings. She had supposedly uncovered the fraudulent scheme through meticulous detective work, following a trail of suspicious transactions that led directly to my doorstep. Her testimony described a sophisticated operation involving falsified documents, manipulated accounting records, and a conspiracy between myself and Cascade Construction to systematically cheat the federal government. The prosecution's narrative was compelling and detailed. They claimed I had helped Cascade Construction hide income through a series of shell companies and fictitious subcontractor arrangements. According to their theory, I had personally benefited from the scheme through inflated consulting fees and under-the-table payments that funded my excessive lifestyle. Michael Brennan worked tirelessly to prepare our defense, but the evidence seemed overwhelming. The prosecution had bank records, document analysis, and expert testimony that appeared to support every element of their case. Most damaging was their possession of what they claimed were the original, unaltered versions of tax documents that differed significantly from the versions in my files. The first crack in my marriage appeared during a particularly brutal evening news segment that featured interviews with former clients expressing their sense of betrayal. Jessica watched in silence as person after person described their shock at learning their trusted accountant was allegedly a criminal. When the segment ended, she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not quite doubt, but something close to it. That night, she asked the question that would haunt our relationship. "Benjamin, is there anything you haven't told me?" The fact that she felt the need to ask broke something fundamental between us, even though I answered with complete honesty about my innocence. The federal courthouse in Portland became my second home during the 3 weeks of trial. Every morning, I walked through crowds of reporters and curious onlookers, my life reduced to a public spectacle that entertainment disguised as justice. Patricia Valdez took the witness stand on day 4, dressed in a conservative Navy suit that projected authority and competence. Her testimony was masterful, detailed, confident, and delivered with the kind of conviction that makes juries believe they're hearing absolute truth. She described her investigation with clinical precision, explaining how she discovered suspicious patterns in Cascade Construction's tax filings that led her to examine my role as their accountant. According to Patricia, red flags appeared when she noticed significant discrepancies between reported income and the company's obvious financial growth. Her account of uncovering the alleged fraud was compelling theater. She walked the jury through bank records, document comparisons, and timeline analysis that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning 3 years. Every piece of evidence seemed to fit perfectly into her narrative of greed and betrayal. The prosecution presented what they claimed were original versions of tax documents that differed dramatically from the copies in my files. Side-by-side comparisons showed income figures that had been reduced, deductions that had been inflated, and signatures that expert witnesses testified had been forged or altered. I watched in horror as Patricia explained how she'd supposedly traced the missing $2.3 million through a complex web of transactions involving multiple accounts and shell companies. Her investigation had allegedly uncovered bank deposits that coincided with tax filing deadlines and cash withdrawals that matched suspicious activity in my personal accounts. The jury hung on every word. Patricia's presentation was so thorough, so convincing, that I began to doubt my own memory. Could someone have altered documents without my knowledge? Had I missed something obvious during my years of working with Cascade Construction? Michael Brennan's cross-examination focused on procedural questions and timeline inconsistencies. But Patricia handled every challenge with calm professionalism. She admitted to some minor errors in dates and documentation, but maintained that the overall pattern of fraud was undeniable. When Michael pressed her about the possibility that documents had been altered after my preparation, Patricia's response was devastating. "Mr. Brennan, I've been investigating tax fraud for 15 years. The evidence clearly shows your client's direct involvement in a sophisticated scheme to defraud the federal government." The prosecution's document expert testified that comparative analysis showed clear evidence of alteration in the tax returns I'd filed. Font inconsistencies, metadata analysis, and paper composition differences all pointed to systematic manipulation of financial records after initial preparation. Their computer forensic specialist claimed to have recovered deleted files from my office computers that showed draft versions of fraudulent documents. The electronic evidence was particularly damaging because it suggested premeditation and careful planning rather than simple mistakes or OVRS day after day. I watched the prosecution build an airtight case using evidence I knew was fabricated. But proving fabrication required resources and expertise that seemed beyond our reach. The federal government had unlimited resources, expert witnesses, and the presumption of institutional credibility. Jessica attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row behind the defense table. But I could feel her growing uncertainty as the evidence mounted. The woman who had married me based on trust and shared values was watching that foundation crumble under the weight of seemingly irrefutable proof of my guilt. The most devastating moment came when the prosecution played recorded phone conversations between myself and Michael Cascade that had been taken completely out of context. Discussions about legitimate tax strategies were presented as evidence of conspiracy, and my professional advice was reframed as criminal instruction. By the end of the prosecution's case, I understood that I wasn't just fighting criminal charges. I was fighting a perfectly constructed frame job that had been designed by someone with intimate knowledge of both tax law and federal investigation procedures. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 17 minutes, long enough to review the evidence, short enough to suggest they'd reached consensus quickly. I spent those hours in the courthouse cafeteria with Michael Brennan, neither of us able to eat or carry on meaningful conversation. When the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict, my legs nearly buckled. Jessica squeezed my hand as we returned to the courtroom, but her palm was cold with sweat. The gallery filled with reporters, former clients, and curious members of the public who had followed the trial through media coverage. The jury foreman was a retired engineer in his 60s, someone I'd hoped might understand the technical complexity of tax preparation and appreciate the impossibility of the conspiracy alleged by the prosecution, but when he stood to deliver the verdict, his expression was grave and certain. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud the Internal Revenue Service, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit me like a physical blow. Jessica's sharp intake of breath was audible in the suddenly silent courtroom. Behind me, I could hear the scratching of reporters' pens and the quiet clicking of camera shutters capturing the moment my life officially ended. On the charge of filing false tax returns, we find the defendant guilty. Each repetition of guilty felt like another shovel of dirt being thrown on my coffin. The charges continued: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and with each verdict, another piece of my identity crumbled away. Jessica's tears started during the fourth guilty verdict. By the time the foreman finished reading all 7 counts, she was sobbing quietly into her hands. When I reached out to comfort her, she pulled away, not from anger, but from the overwhelming realization that everything we'd built together was gone. Judge Martinez called for order as spectators began filing out of the courtroom. The media representatives rushed toward the exit, eager to report the conviction that would lead the evening news cycle. Former clients and community members who had attended the trial looked at me with mixtures of disappointment, vindication, and pity. The judge's lecture before sentencing was particularly painful because it focused on betrayal of public trust. She spoke about the special responsibility that accountants bear in maintaining the integrity of the tax system and the damage that my alleged crimes had inflicted on both individual clients and society as a whole. "Mr. Rivers," she said, looking directly at me with stern disapproval, "you held a position of trust in this community. Families and small businesses relied on your expertise and integrity. Your actions have not only violated federal law, but have damaged the faith that hardworking taxpayers place in professionals like yourself. 8 years in federal prison, plus restitution of $2.3 million, money I'd never stolen and couldn't possibly repay." The sentence was devastating but not unexpected. Federal guidelines for tax fraud were severe, and my conviction on multiple counts had made a lengthy prison term inevitable. Michael Brennan requested that I be allowed to remain free pending appeal, but the prosecution argued that my crimes demonstrated a pattern of deception that made me a flight risk. Judge Martinez agreed, ordering that I be taken into custody immediately. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters as federal marshals led me toward a waiting transport vehicle. Camera crews jostled for position while reporters shouted questions about my crimes, my victims, and my plans for appeal. I managed one final statement of innocence, but my words were lost in the chaos of a media-feeding frenzy. That night, in a federal holding cell awaiting transfer to prison, I realized that proving my innocence would be exponentially more difficult than defending against the original charges. The justice system had spoken, my community had rendered judgment, and my wife had begun the emotional process of accepting that the man she'd married was apparently someone she'd never really known. The prison intake form reduced my entire identity to a series of checkboxes and measurements: height, weight, scars, tattoos, education level, criminal history. Everything that had defined Benjamin Rivers, CPA, was now irrelevant. I was prisoner, number 472916061, convicted of tax fraud, scheduled for release in 2029, Federal Correctional Institution, Sheridan, sat in the middle of Oregon farmland, surrounded by razor wire and guard towers that reminded every inmate of their separation from the world they'd lost. The processing procedure was designed to strip away dignity along with personal belongings: strip searches, delousing showers, and the humiliation of begging for basic necessities like soap and toilet paper. My cellmate was Terry Nakamura, a former bank vice president serving 6 years for embezzlement. Terry had been at Sheridan for 18 months and understood the unspoken rules that governed daily survival. He taught me which guards to avoid, which inmates commanded respect, and how to navigate the complex social hierarchy that determined everything from meal portions to recreational privileges. The daily routine became my new reality. Wake-up call at 5:30 a.m., count time every 4 hours, meals in a cafeteria that served food designed for nutrition rather than taste, and lights out at 10 p.m. The predictability was simultaneously comforting and soul-crushing. Every day identical, to the one before, stretching endlessly toward a release date that felt impossibly distant. I maintained my innocence to anyone who would listen. But most inmates had heard similar claims from countless other prisoners. Terry's advice was practical. Everyone in here is innocent, Benjamin. Focus on surviving your sentence, not proving your case. But I couldn't accept that resignation. During my first month, I spent every free moment in the prison library, researching appeals procedures, studying criminal law, and reading about other cases involving prosecutorial misconduct. The law library became my sanctuary, a place where I could maintain hope that justice might eventually prevail. My job assignment in the prison library paid 23 cents per hour but provided access to legal resources and quiet time for research. I helped other inmates with their appeals, wrote letters for illiterate prisoners, and gradually built a reputation as someone who understood the legal system. The isolation from my former life was complete. Friends stopped writing after the first few months, professional colleagues severed all contact, and the business I'd spent 15 years building disappeared as if it had never existed. My clients found new accountants, my office lease was terminated, and Rivers Tax Services became just another cautionary tale about white-collar crime. The hardest part was the loss of purpose. For 15 years, my identity had been built around helping people navigate complex financial challenges. In prison, I was just another number in a system designed to warehouse criminals until society deemed them worthy of release. Sleep became elusive as I replayed every detail of Patricia Valdez's investigation, searching for clues I'd missed or opportunities to expose the truth. The evidence against me had been so comprehensive, so perfectly constructed, that I began to wonder if I was suffering from some kind of psychological break that prevented me from accepting reality. Terry often found me staring at the ceiling during the long hours between lights out and sleep. His own experience with the federal justice system had taught him that obsessing over past injustices was a recipe for psychological destruction. But I couldn't let go of the certainty that someone had systematically destroyed my life through an elaborate deception. The prison environment was a constant reminder of how completely I'd fallen from grace. Murderers, drug dealers, and armed robbers treated me with the particular disdain reserved for white-collar criminals, people they viewed as having had every advantage in life but choosing crime anyway. The divorce decree arrived 18 months into my sentence, delivered in a manila envelope that felt heavier than its physical weight suggested. I sat alone in my cell, staring at Jessica's signature on documents that legally dissolved our marriage and everything we'd built together. Her attorney's letter was clinical and efficient, explaining the division of assets and the reasoning behind her decision to end our marriage. The house we'd bought together would be sold to help cover my legal debts. The modest savings account we'd accumulated over 7 years of marriage would go toward restitution payments. Even my personal belongings had been donated to charity. Jessica couldn't bear to keep reminders of our life together. The most devastating paragraph was Jessica's personal statement, required by Oregon law for divorce proceedings involving incarcerated spouses. She wrote about the impossibility of maintaining a marriage with someone she no longer recognized, the daily humiliation of being known as the wife of a convicted felon, and her need to rebuild her life without the shadow of my crimes. I married Benjamin Rivers, a man I believed was honest, ethical, and committed to serving our community, she wrote. The evidence presented at trial has shown me that either I never really knew my husband, or that the pressures of success transformed him into someone capable of betraying everything we claimed to value together. Reading those words in the solitude of my 8-by-10-foot cell was more painful than the guilty verdict had been. The justice system had taken my freedom, but Jessica's decision took my hope. She had been the one person whose faith in my innocence might have sustained me through the darkest moments of incarceration. I was allowed one phone call to respond to the divorce papers. Jessica's voice was cold and distant, the warm, loving tone I remembered replaced by the careful politeness of a stranger. She'd already moved out of our house and was staying with her sister while looking for a new apartment. "I can't do this anymore, Benjamin," she said when I tried to explain my innocence one more time. "I've spent 18 months defending you. To my family, my friends, and my colleagues, I've lost friendships because people think I'm naive for believing your story. I can't sacrifice any more of my life for something that may never be resolved." Her decision to use her maiden name professionally hurt more than I'd expected. Jessica Rivers was becoming Jessica Martinez again, erasing our shared identity as completely as if our marriage had never happened. She was 29 years old with her entire life ahead of her, too young to spend the next 6 years waiting for a husband who might never be able to prove his innocence. The property settlement was straightforward because we'd had so little to divide. Our modest assets were overwhelmed by legal fees, court costs, and the restitution order that would follow me for decades. Jessica kept her car and personal belongings. Everything else was liquidated to satisfy my growing debt obligations. The timing of the divorce felt particularly cruel because I've been planning to use our anniversary as an opportunity to write Jessica a letter explaining my legal research and my growing certainty that Patricia Valdez had somehow manufactured the evidence against me. Instead, I spent our former anniversary date signing papers that legally severed the most important relationship in my life. Terry tried to offer comfort, but his own divorce during incarceration had left him cynical about maintaining relationships. From prison, "Most marriages don't survive federal sentences," he told me. "The women who wait are either saints or co-conspirators. Jessica's just being honest about what she can handle." That night, I understood the full scope of what had been stolen from me. Not just money, not just freedom, but the entire foundation of my adult life, my career, my reputation, my marriage, and my place in the community I'd served for 15 years. Marcus Webb's legal brief drafts covered every surface of his cell handwritten notes, documenting 15 years of what he claimed was systematic FBI corruption that had destroyed his career and landed him in federal prison. When he arrived at Sheridan 6 months after my divorce was finalized, I recognized a kindred spirit fighting the same impossible battle for vindication. Marcus had been a decorated FBI agent for 12 years before being convicted of accepting bribes from organized crime figures in Chicago. Like me, he maintained his innocence with the kind of passionate conviction that most inmates eventually abandoned. But unlike me, Marcus understood the federal law enforcement system from the inside. He was 48 years old, built like someone who'd spent decades staying in fighting shape, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His street-smart approach to prison politics kept him safe, while his legal knowledge made him valuable to other inmates pursuing appeals. "The first thing you need to understand," Marcus told me during our initial conversation in the library, "is that federal agents aren't superhuman. They make mistakes, cut corners, and sometimes manufacture evidence to close cases that define their careers." I shared my case details with him over several weeks, describing Patricia Valdez's investigation, the evidence that had convicted me, and my growing certainty that the entire prosecution had been built on fabricated documents. Marcus listened, without judgment, asking detailed questions about procedures, timelines, and investigative methods. His assessment was both encouraging and terrifying. "The precision of this frame job suggests someone with intimate knowledge of both tax law and federal investigation procedures," he said after reviewing my handwritten case summary. "This wasn't some improvised scheme. It was a professionally executed operation, designed to destroy you while enriching someone else." Marcus's observation about the too-perfect nature of the evidence resonated with my own instincts. The $2.30 million figure, the convenient discovery of altered documents, and Patricia Valdez's flawless investigation had all seemed suspiciously orchestrated during the trial. "In my experience," Marcus continued, "investigations that wrap up this neatly usually involve either exceptional luck or deliberate manipulation. Since luck doesn't typically favor federal agents pursuing complex financial crimes, I'd bet on manipulation." His suggestion that I focus specifically on Patricia Valdez's role became the foundation of my new research strategy. Instead of trying to prove my innocence directly, I needed to demonstrate that the person who had built the case against me had motives and opportunities to fabricate evidence. Marcus warned me about the dangers of pursuing justice from behind bars. "Prison investigations are limited by resources, access, and credibility," he explained. "Even if you uncover smoking gun evidence, Getting anyone to take seriously the claims of a convicted felon requires extraordinary proof. But he also understood the psychological necessity of fighting back. The alternative is accepting that you'll spend the rest of your life as a labeled criminal even after release, he said. Sometimes the fight for vindication is more about maintaining your sanity than achieving actual justice. Our friendship developed around shared evening conversations about legal strategy, systemic corruption, and the challenge of maintaining hope in an environment designed to break down human spirit. Marcus had survived 3 years of incarceration. By focusing on the future rather than dwelling on past injustices, he taught me practical lessons about prison survival while I helped him research federal appeals procedures that might apply to his own case. Our collaboration became a lifeline for both of us, proof that intelligence, dignity, and purpose could survive even in federal prison. Marcus's warning about pursuing justice from behind bars proved prophetic, but his encouragement to focus on Patricia Valdez would eventually lead to the breakthrough that changed everything. Patricia Valdez's personnel file became my obsession, assembled piece by piece through prison library resources, correspondence with attorneys, and careful analysis of public records available through Freedom of Information Act requests. What I discovered painted a picture of an agent whose career success seemed suspiciously tied to high-profile convictions in complex financial cases. Patricia had joined the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in 2008, straight out of graduate school. With a master's degree in forensic accounting, her early cases involved routine tax evasion prosecutions with modest penalties and short sentences. But starting in 2015, her caseload shifted dramatically toward complex conspiracies involving significant amounts of money and lengthy prison sentences. The pattern was remarkable in its consistency. Patricia's investigations typically involved successful small business owners, accused of sophisticated fraud schemes that resulted in convictions, substantial restitution orders, and career-ending prison sentences. Her conviction rate was near perfect 93% over 6 years, which had earned her commendations and rapid promotion within the Criminal Investigation Division. But the more I studied her cases, the more suspicious patterns emerged. Her targets were always financially successful but not wealthy enough to afford the kind of aggressive legal defense that might expose prosecutorial misconduct. They were community pillars whose falls from grace generated significant media attention and reinforced public faith in federal law enforcement. I spent months corresponding with attorneys who had represented Patricia's previous targets, carefully crafting letters that requested information about investigation procedures, evidence collection, and document authentication. Most attorneys ignored my inquiries, but a few provided details that supported my growing suspicions about her methods. A defense attorney in Seattle mentioned concerns about document alterations in a case involving a construction company owner convicted of tax fraud in 2018. The client maintained his innocence but accepted a plea bargain rather than risk a lengthy trial. Sound familiar? The parallels to my own case were unmistakable, another attorney in Sacramento described. Patricia's investigation of a restaurant owner accused of hiding cash income through a complex skimming operation. The evidence had been comprehensive and convincing, but the defendant's family insisted the financial records had been altered after seizure by federal agents. The most disturbing pattern involved the amounts of money allegedly stolen in Patricia's cases. 7 different prosecutions over 4 years had resulted in restitution, orders totaling nearly $12 million money that defendants claimed they had never actually stolen. If Patricia was systematically framing successful small business owners, where was all that money going? My correspondence with the IRS Internal Affairs Division was less productive. Their form letter response acknowledged my complaint about Patricia's conduct but explained that personnel matters were confidential and that my conviction prevented them from seriously considering allegations of investigative misconduct. However, a retired IR supervisor who had worked with Patricia early in her career provided an interesting perspective through his response to my carefully worded inquiry. He described her as ambitious to a fault and someone who seemed more interested in conviction statistics than tax compliance. Marcus Webb helped me analyze the financial implications of Patricia's successful prosecutions. If she was systematically stealing money while framing business owners for the theft, she would need sophisticated methods for laundering and hiding the proceeds. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and cryptocurrency transactions were all possibilities for someone with her access to federal investigation resources. The frustration of conducting this research from prison was overwhelming. I had access to basic legal resources and correspondence privileges, but I couldn't interview witnesses, examine physical evidence, or hire professional investigators to pursue leads that might prove my theories. My growing file of evidence and connections filled 3 boxes in my cell, representing hundreds of hours of research and analysis. But without freedom to act on my discoveries, the information felt more like intellectual exercise than practical path toward vindication. The newspaper article that changed everything was buried on page 4 of the Oregonian's business section, a small item that most readers probably skipped entirely. But when Terry Nakamura handed me the clipping during our usual evening conversation, my hands started shaking before I'd finished reading the headline, "IRS Agent Suspended Amid Corruption Investigation." The article was brief but devastating. Patricia Valdez had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into financial irregularities discovered during a routine audit of the Criminal Investigation Division's Portland office. Sources within the IRS described the investigation as focusing on potential conflicts of interest and unauthorized financial activities. My heart raced as I read the details. The investigation had been triggered by discrepancies in evidence, handling procedures, and questions about Patricia's personal financial situation that seemed inconsistent with her government salary. While the article was careful to avoid specific allegations, the implications were clear. Patricia Valdez was under investigation for the same kind of financial crimes she'd spent her career prosecuting. I immediately called Michael Brennan from the prison payphone, my voice barely controlled as I read him the article over the crackling connection. His initial reaction was skeptical. Newspaper articles about pending investigations weren't grounds for appeal, but I could hear his interest building as I explained the potential connection to my case. "Benjamin," he said after a long pause, "if there's any truth to these allegations, we need to move quickly. Federal investigations of law enforcement personnel move fast once they begin, and evidence has a way of disappearing when agents realize they're under scrutiny." Michael's enthusiasm was infectious, but cautious. He'd seen too many false hopes during appeals processes to get carried away by a single newspaper article. But he agreed to hire a private investigator to examine Patricia's financial situation and look for connections to my case. The decision to pursue this new lead felt like stepping off a cliff. I'd already exhausted our family's savings on legal fees, and hiring a private investigator would require borrowing against Jessica's teacher's pension money she needed for her own financial security. But this was the first real break in my case since the conviction, and I couldn't let financial constraints prevent me from pursuing what might be my only chance for vindication. Marcus Webb's reaction to the article was immediate and strategic. "This is exactly what I've been telling you to look for," he said, studying the clipping with the intensity of someone who understood federal investigations from the inside. Internal affairs investigations don't get triggered by minor procedural violations. Someone found serious evidence of misconduct. He helped me draft a letter to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, carefully worded to request information about Patricia's investigation without revealing too much about my own research. The letter described my conviction and raised questions about potential prosecutorial misconduct that might be relevant to their ongoing investigation. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something approaching hope. The sensation was almost painful after so many months of resignation and despair. I'd maintained my innocence throughout the investigation, trial, and imprisonment, but I'd begun to accept that proving my innocence might be impossible. Now, suddenly, there was a possibility that Patricia Valdez's downfall might provide the key to my own vindication. If she was corrupt, if she'd been systematically framing innocent people while stealing money herself, then my case would be just one example of a larger pattern of criminal behavior. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my cell, imagining the possibility of freedom, vindication, and the chance to rebuild my life. For the first time since my arrest, the future seemed to hold something besides endless years of imprisonment and permanent disgrace. The private investigator's report arrived 6 weeks later, 43 pages of financial analysis that vindicated every suspicion I'd harbored about Patricia Valdez's investigation of my case. Sarah Chun was a former federal agent who specialized in white-collar crime investigations, and her findings were methodical, comprehensive, and absolutely damning. Patricia Valdez maintained 3 bank accounts that investigators had previously overlooked, 2 domestic accounts in Oregon and Washington, plus an offshore account in the Cayman Islands that had been established just 2 months before her investigation of Cascade Construction began. The offshore account was the smoking gun that changed everything. The Cayman Islands account contained exactly $2.3 million, the precise amount of money I'd allegedly stolen from the federal government. The deposits corresponded perfectly with the timeline of my investigation and prosecution, beginning with an initial transfer of $400,000. Just days after Patricia first visited my office, Sarah's analysis of the transaction history revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that utilized cryptocurrency exchanges, shell companies, and offshore banking to hide the proceeds of Patricia's crimes. The deposits weren't random amounts, they were calculated transfers that corresponded to the alleged losses in specific cases Patricia had prosecuted. The most shocking discovery was that my case wasn't unique. Patricia had used the same methods to frame at least 6 other small business owners over 4 years, systematically stealing money while building false criminal cases that sent innocent people to federal prison. The total amount of her theft exceeded $12 million, hidden across multiple offshore accounts and investment vehicles. Sarah's investigation revealed how Patricia had manipulated evidence in my case. She had access to sophisticated document alteration software through her position with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, allowing her to create fake versions of tax returns and financial records that supported her fabricated fraud theories. The computer forensics evidence that had been so damaging during my trial was particularly damning when viewed through the lens of Patricia's corruption. The deleted files supposedly recovered from my office computers had actually been created on Patricia's government-issued laptop and transferred to my seized equipment after my arrest. Even more disturbing was Sarah's discovery that Patricia had recruited accomplices within the federal prosecutor's office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The corruption wasn't limited to a single rogue agent. It involved a conspiracy of federal employees who had been systematically framing innocent people while enriching themselves through elaborate theft schemes. Michael Brennan's excitement was palpable when he called to discuss Sarah's findings. "Benjamin, this is the kind of evidence that doesn't just overturn convictions, it triggers federal grand jury investigations into prosecutorial misconduct," he said. "We're not just talking about your vindication anymore. We're talking about exposing one of the largest corruption scandals in federal law enforcement history." The evidence was so overwhelming that Michael immediately contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit to report Patricia's crimes. But he warned me that federal investigations of law enforcement misconduct move slowly and that my release might take months or even years, while various agencies sorted through the implications of Patricia's corruption. Sarah's investigation also revealed why Patricia had targeted me specifically. Rivers Tax Services had been profitable enough to suggest hidden assets, but small enough that I couldn't afford the kind of aggressive legal defense that might have exposed her methods. I was the perfect victim, successful enough to be worth framing, vulnerable enough to be easily destroyed. The timing of her investigation hadn't been coincidental either. Patricia had been under financial pressure due to gambling debts and an expensive divorce settlement. My case had provided her with the opportunity to steal enough money to solve her personal financial problems while advancing her career through another high-profile conviction. For the first time since my arrest, I understood exactly how and why my life had been destroyed. The FBI raid report that documented Patricia Valdez's arrest read like vindication served with a side of justice. 27 federal agents had descended on her Portland home at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, armed with warrants that authorized seizure of computers, financial records, and any evidence related to her. Systematic corruption of federal tax investigations. News of Patricia's arrest reached Sheridan through the prison's informal communication network before it hit the evening news. Marcus Webb found me in the library, his face showing the mixture of satisfaction and relief that comes with seeing justice finally served. "They got her, Benjamin," he said, sliding a printed news article across the table. Patricia Valdez was arrested this morning on charges including bribery, conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The FBI says she's been systematically framing innocent people for years. My emotional breakdown was immediate and overwhelming. 3 years of suppressed rage, grief, and frustration erupted in the quiet sanctuary of the prison library. I'd maintained my composure through arrest, trial, conviction, and imprisonment, but the vindication of seeing Patricia finally exposed as the criminal she'd always been broke down every emotional barrier I'd constructed. The news coverage was extensive and brutal. Local television stations led with stories about the corrupt IRS agent who had sent innocent people to prison while stealing millions of dollars. My picture appeared alongside those of Patricia's other victims, successful business owners whose lives had been destroyed by her elaborate fraud schemes. My first phone call was to Jessica, the woman who had divorced me rather than continue believing in my innocence. Her voice was different when she answered, softer, tentative, and tinged with what might have been regret. "Benjamin," she said, after I explained the news about Patricia's arrest, "I don't know what to say. I've been following the news reports, and I'm starting to understand that maybe I was wrong about everything." For the first time in 3 years, Jessica sounded like the woman I'd married. The cold distance that had characterized our divorce proceedings was replaced by the warmth and vulnerability that had originally drawn us together. She admitted that doubts about my guilt had been growing since our divorce, especially as she reflected on the 15 years she'd known me. "I married an honest man," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Even when the evidence seemed overwhelming, something deep down insisted that you weren't capable of the crimes they described. I should have trusted that instinct instead of letting fear and social pressure convince me to abandon you." The media attention surrounding Patricia's arrest was unprecedented for a federal law enforcement corruption case. Her victims included not just the business owners she'd framed, but also their families, employees, and entire communities that had been damaged by her systematic destruction of innocent people's lives. My interview with FBI agents from the public corruption unit took place in the prison conference room, with Michael Brennan participating by phone. Agent Sarah Martinez and Agent David Chun were thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about Patricia's investigation methods, her behavior during our meetings, and any suspicious elements I'd noticed during the original inquiry. I provided them with every detail I could remember about Patricia's investigation, including her unusually specific questions about Cascade Construction, her apparent familiarity with financial details she shouldn't have known, and her confident demeanor throughout proceedings that should have been exploratory rather than conclusive. The agents confirmed that Patricia had indeed been systematically stealing money while framing business owners for the thefts. Her sophisticated money laundering operation had allowed her to hide millions of dollars while building false criminal cases that sent innocent people to federal prison. Their investigation revealed that my case was actually one of Patricia's most elaborate frame jobs involving forged documents, manipulated computer evidence, and coordinated testimony from accomplices within the federal prosecutor's office. The exoneration order arrived on a Thursday morning in November, 3 months after Patricia Valdez's arrest. Federal Judge Martinez, the same judge who had sentenced me to 8 years in prison, signed the document that officially dismissed all charges and ordered my immediate release from federal custody. Michael Brennan's phone call woke me from restless sleep at 6 a.m. "Benjamin," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it's over. Judge Martinez has overturned your conviction based on prosecutorial misconduct. You're going home today." The surreal nature of sudden freedom after 3 years of imprisonment was overwhelming. One moment I was prisoner 4729161, scheduled for release in 2029. The next moment I was Benjamin Rivers, wrongfully convicted victim of federal corruption. Cleared of all charges and free to rebuild my shattered life, the processing procedure for release was surprisingly swift compared to the deliberate humiliation of intake 3 years earlier. Federal marshals who had once viewed me as a convicted felon now treated me with the deference reserved for someone who had been victimized by the system they served. Media crews waited outside the prison gates, alerted by Michael Brennan that my release would provide an opportunity to interview one of Patricia Valdez's victims. I'd spent 3 years imagining this moment, but the reality was more complex than my fantasies of vindication. My statement to the assembled reporters was brief but heartfelt. 3 years ago, Patricia Valdez destroyed my life through an elaborate scheme designed to enrich herself while sending innocent people to prison. Today, justice has finally been served, but the cost of her corruption can never be fully repaid. The drive to Portland with Michael Brennan felt like traveling through a foreign country. 3 years of imprisonment had isolated me from changes in technology, culture, and even the physical landscape of the city where I'd built my life. Portland had continued evolving while I remained frozen in time behind prison walls. My first taste of freedom was a cup of coffee at a downtown cafe near Michael's office. The simple pleasure of choosing what to drink, where to sit, and how long to stay was almost overwhelming after years of regimented prison routine. Every decision, no matter how trivial, felt like a small miracle. The bittersweet realization that vindication couldn't restore everything I'd lost hit me during that first afternoon of freedom. My business was gone, my marriage had ended, my reputation required complete reconstruction, and 3 years of my life had been stolen by someone whose greed and ambition had destroyed multiple families. But there was also profound relief in the knowledge that truth had finally prevailed. The doubts that had plagued my darkest moments in prison, the whispered questions about whether I might somehow be guilty of crimes I couldn't remember, were permanently silenced by the overwhelming evidence of Patricia's systematic corruption. The evening news coverage was extensive and largely sympathetic. Reporters described me as a victim of one of the largest federal law enforcement corruption scandals in recent history. My story became part of a larger narrative about the need for oversight and accountability in federal investigations. Jessica called that evening, her voice tentative but warm. "Benjamin, I saw the news coverage of your release," she said. No, I have no right to ask, but would you be willing to meet for coffee? There are things I need to say, apologies I need to make. The invitation represented the first step toward healing relationships that had been damaged by Patricia's crimes. But I understood that rebuilding trust with Jessica, with my community, and with myself would require time, patience, and the kind of emotional courage that surviving prison had taught me to summon when everything seemed impossible. That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in 3 years, I felt the complex mixture of emotions that defines true vindication relief: gratitude, anger, and determination to ensure that Patricia's victims received justice and that systemic reforms prevented future corruption. The lawsuit filing against the federal government represented more than just seeking financial compensation. It was a formal demand for accountability and recognition that Patricia Valdez's corruption had been enabled by systemic failures within federal law enforcement. Michael Brennan filed the civil rights violation lawsuit 6 weeks after my release, seeking damages for wrongful imprisonment, lost income, and the destruction of my reputation. Returning to a world that had moved on without me was more challenging than I'd anticipated during my years in prison. Technology had evolved, Portland's business community had changed, and the professional relationships I'd spent 15 years building had withered during my incarceration. I was a 45-year-old ex-convict, starting over with nothing but vindication and determination. The public apology from IRS Director Catherine Walsh was formal and carefully worded, acknowledging that Patricia Valdez's actions had violated the trust that taxpayers place in federal law enforcement while promising reforms to prevent similar corruption in the future. But bureaucratic apologies couldn't restore the years I'd lost or repair the damage to my family relationships. My awkward reunion with former clients and colleagues revealed the complex social dynamics of vindication. Some people were genuinely remorseful about their quick abandonment during my legal troubles, while others seemed uncomfortable with the reminder that they'd believed false accusations against someone they'd known for years. The mixed reactions from Portland's business community were predictable but still painful. My vindication had proven that federal investigators could systematically frame innocent people, which made everyone question their own vulnerability to similar persecution. Some welcomed me back with warmth and support. Others seemed to view me as a reminder of how quickly success could be destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. My coffee meeting with Jessica was emotionally exhausting but necessary for both of our healing processes. She looked older, more cautious, but still recognizably the woman I'd married 8 years earlier. Her apology was sincere and detailed, acknowledging the pain her divorce had added to my imprisonment. "I abandoned you when you needed me most," she said, tears flowing freely in the quiet corner of the cafe where we'd had our first date. "I let fear and social pressure convince me that the federal government couldn't be wrong about something so serious. I should have trusted the man I married instead of believing strangers who claimed to know you better than I did." Her explanation of the social isolation she'd experienced as the wife of a convicted felon helped me understand her decision to seek divorce. Teachers, parents, and community members had treated her with suspicion and pity, making her daily life a constant reminder of my alleged crimes. The pressure had been overwhelming for someone in her 20s with no experience navigating public scandal, but Jessica's decision to attend every day of Patricia Valdez's trial demonstrated her commitment to understanding the truth about my case. She'd seen the evidence of Patricia's systematic corruption, heard testimony about the elaborate frame job that had destroyed my life, and understood the magnitude of the injustice I'd suffered. The gradual process of rebuilding our relationship began with weekly coffee meetings that slowly evolved into longer conversations about our shared past and uncertain future. We were different people than the couple who had married in 2017. I'd been hardened by prison while she'd been strengthened by surviving social ostracism, but our fundamental values remained compatible. My decision to pivot from tax preparation to advocacy work felt like a natural evolution of my professional identity. The skills that had made me successful as an accountant, attention to detail, understanding of complex regulations, and commitment to protecting client interests translated perfectly to helping other victims of government misconduct. The challenge was rebuilding credibility and financial stability while pursuing justice for Patricia Valdez's other victims. My reputation was technically restored, but practical trust would require time and demonstrated competence in my new role as an advocate for people wrongfully accused by federal agencies. The new business license for Rivers Justice Advocacy Services represented a complete transformation of my professional identity, from helping people comply with tax law to helping them fight back against government persecution. The small office I rented in Southeast Portland was modest compared to my previous practice, but it represented hope for both myself and the clients who desperately needed someone who understood federal corruption from personal experience. My first client was Maria Santos, a small restaurant owner facing IRS criminal charges eerily similar to those that had destroyed my life. Her case bore all the hallmarks of Patricia Valdez's methods: precise financial allegations, convenient discovery of altered documents, and an investigation timeline that seemed designed to maximize prosecution advantage rather than uncover truth. Maria had found me through news coverage of my vindication and Patricia's conviction. She was 38 years old, a single mother who had built her restaurant from nothing into a neighborhood institution that employed 12 people and served as a community gathering place. The IRS claimed she'd hidden $180,000 in cash income over 2 years. Money she swore she'd never stolen. Working on Maria's case felt like reclaiming my professional purpose while serving a cause larger than personal vindication. My experience with federal investigations, combined with contacts I developed during my own legal battle, allowed me to provide representation that most small business owners couldn't afford from traditional criminal defense attorneys. The investigation revealed that Maria's case was being handled by associates of Patricia Valdez, who had learned her methods but lacked her sophistication. Document analysis showed clear evidence of alteration. Timeline discrepancies suggested manufactured evidence, and financial records contained suspicious inconsistencies that favored the prosecution's theory over reality. My testimony before Congress about IRS corruption and accountability was televised on C-SPAN and covered by major news outlets as part of ongoing oversight hearings following Patricia's conviction. I described the systematic nature of her crimes, the vulnerability of small business owners to federal persecution, and the need for reforms that would prevent future corruption. Members of Congress, I said during my opening statement, Patricia Valdez didn't just steal money, she stole lives, families, and faith in American justice. Her victims included not just the people she sent to prison, but their spouses, children, employees, and entire communities that were damaged by her systematic destruction of innocent people's reputations. The slow process of rebuilding trust with Jessica evolved from weekly coffee meetings to dinners, weekend activities, and eventually overnight visits that felt like rediscovering our compatibility. While acknowledging how much we both changed, we were cautious about rushing into remarriage, but committed to exploring whether our relationship could survive the trauma we'd both experienced. Jessica's support for my advocacy work was crucial to its early success. Her teaching background helped her understand the importance of education and prevention in fighting government corruption, and her experience with my case gave her insights that enhanced my ability to help other victims. My speaking engagements about surviving injustice and rebuilding after wrongful conviction became a regular source of both income and personal healing. Audiences responded to the authenticity of someone who had actually experienced federal prosecution, imprisonment, and vindication rather than just read about it in law books. The gradual healing of my reputation within Portland's business community was measured in small gestures: former clients referring new business, colleagues inviting me to professional events, and community leaders seeking my input on criminal justice reform initiatives. Trust was being rebuilt one relationship at a time, but the most meaningful validation came from other victims of federal misconduct who contacted me for help. Each case reinforced my understanding that Patricia Valdez's corruption was part of a larger pattern of prosecutorial abuse that required systematic reform rather than just individual vindication. The settlement agreement with the federal government arrived 18 months after my release, a document that officially valued 3 years of wrongful imprisonment at $5 million while establishing precedent for other victims of Patricia Valdez's systematic corruption. The check couldn't restore the years I'd lost, but it provided resources to expand my advocacy work and ensure that other innocent people received the legal representation they deserved. Patricia Valdez's sentencing hearing was held in the same courtroom where I'd been convicted 4 years earlier. Judge Martinez sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison, 4 years longer than I'd originally faced, plus restitution of the full $12.4 million she'd stolen from the federal government while framing innocent business owners watching. Patricia, led away in shackles, provided the satisfaction of seeing justice served, but it also reminded me of the human cost of corruption that extended far beyond individual victims. Her crimes had damaged faith in federal law enforcement, destroyed multiple families, and created cynicism about government integrity that would persist long after her imprisonment ended. My decision to donate $2 million of the settlement to innocence projects across the country felt like the most meaningful use of money that had been earned through suffering. The donation funded legal representation for wrongfully convicted people, supported investigative journalism that exposed prosecutorial misconduct, and established scholarships for law students committed to criminal justice reform. The renewal of our marriage vows with Jessica took place in the same community center where we'd first met 9 years earlier. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by family, friends, and colleagues who had supported us through our darkest period. We exchanged rings and promises that acknowledged both our shared trauma and our commitment to building a stronger relationship. Jessica's decision to return to teaching after taking a year off to help establish Rivers Justice Advocacy Services demonstrated her own healing and growth. She'd found purpose in supporting victims of government misconduct while maintaining her professional identity as an educator committed to serving her community. My reflection on the cost of truth and the price of justice had evolved from bitter anger to purposeful determination. Patricia Valdez had stolen 3 years of my life, destroyed my first marriage, and cost me a business I'd spent 15 years building. But her crimes had also revealed my capacity for resilience, introduced me to the community of people fighting government corruption, and provided me with a mission that felt more meaningful than tax preparation had ever been. The message I shared with other people facing similar battles was rooted in hard-won wisdom about the importance of maintaining hope even when justice seems impossible. The system failed all of us, I told audiences at criminal justice reform conferences. But the system also eventually exposed the truth and held the corrupt accountable. That gives me hope that reform is possible and that other innocent people can survive what we survived. The establishment of the Rivers Foundation for Victims of Government Corruption became my lasting legacy, funded by the settlement money and dedicated to providing legal representation, investigative resources, and emotional support for people wrongfully accused by federal agencies. The Foundation's work expanded beyond Patricia's victims to include anyone who had been persecuted by corrupt government officials. My final thoughts on resilience, truth, and the long arc of justice were shaped by the understanding that vindication is both personal triumph and collective responsibility. Individual victims of government misconduct cannot achieve justice alone. They need community support, media attention, legal expertise, and systemic reform that prevents future corruption. The arc of justice is indeed long, and it bends toward truth only when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Patricia Valdez's downfall proved that even sophisticated corruption schemes eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, but only when victims maintain hope and continue fighting despite overwhelming odds. My story ended, not with simple revenge, but with the complex satisfaction of seeing truth prevail while using that victory to help others facing similar battles. Justice had been served, relationships had been healed, and purpose had been discovered in the most unlikely circumstances.